Hi, Gregory.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. And yourself?
I'm doing okay. I should tell people I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and you are Gregory Johnsen, a scholar of Middle Eastern studies. You're in Cairo right now, I think, but you're actually an expert on Yemen, which has been much in the news lately. But I think as much as it's been in the news, people may not totally realize how important it is, because the unrest there is leading the Obama administration to usher in a new policy toward Yemen that's going to involve a lot of drone strikes, and that some people think is a major blunder. And I want to talk about that, about whether that is or is not going to serve America's national security. But I should say we're lucky to have you, because you're really the go-to guy in Yemen these days. I see you in a lot of media venues. Your blog, is it al-Waq? Is that?
Yeah, Waq al-Waq.
Okay, your pronunciation sounded a little more authentic than mine. And your Twitter feed is growing in fame. Foreign Policy Magazine recently named the most important 100 Twitters in the known universe, or tweeters, I guess. And in the Middle East section, there were only 20, and that includes all the Middle East, and you were one of them. So congratulations on joining the Twitterati. I'm sure you're getting invited to the finest parties in Cairo since that happened.
Oh, yes, yes.
It's an exotic life. So anyway, I guess, of course, there's been turmoil in a lot of countries in the Arab world. But I think a lot of people believe that Yemen may harbor the most immediate threat to the United States, because that's where a branch of al-Qaeda is located that has, first of all, tried to launch some actual attacks on America, such as the famous underwear bomber in Christmas of, I guess, '09. In addition to that, that branch of al-Qaeda includes this American former imam named al-Waq, who is an inspiration to some, has been apparently an inspiration in some homegrown terrorism, such as the Fort Hood shooter. So anyway, a lot of people think that these are, there are some pretty grave threats to America running around Yemen. Whether or not that's true, the Obama administration is acting as if it were, whatever the actual magnitude of the threat, and they are going to do this big escalation of drone strikes that I know you've written about, and that we'll want to talk about, although I also want to back up and kind of flesh out the whole context as our conversation proceeds. So anyway, so far, do you think I've got that about right? And if not, what would you amend or add?
Yeah, I think that certainly sets the table, particularly for the al-Qaeda threat within Yemen. There's a lot that we as outside observers just don't know, and I think there's a lot that people on the ground in Yemen just don't know, particularly given some of the confused reporting that's coming out of the south around the areas of Zanzibar and Abiyan, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a moment when we talk about al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Well, we could start with some of the reports. Some of the reports have al-Qaeda actually occupying significant swaths of territory now, which they had not done before, and actually taking over some cities. Are those the reports you're alluding to?
Yeah, this is something that back in May, in one of the southern provinces of Yemen, which borders on the ocean there, a province of Abiyan, militants took over the city of Zanzibar, which is the capital of the province of Abiyan in the south. And this is something that a lot of people have been quite confused about what's going on. And part of the reason is that President Saleh has historically exaggerated the threat of al-Qaeda in an attempt to get money and military equipment from the West, and particularly from the United States. Mm-hmm. But at the same time that that's happened, the opposition in Yemen has consistently and constantly downplayed the threat of al-Qaeda, saying essentially that they're just a puppet of Saleh's regime that he uses, and that they don't exist anywhere outside of the presidential palace. And so essentially what we have is, on one one level in Yemen, al-Qaeda has become just the stick that different groups use to beat one another with. And that has certainly muddied the reports that are coming out from this province of Abiyan. But we do know that people are fighting, and there are a number of people dying. It's just not altogether clear how many of these individuals, how many of the militants are actually members of al-Qaeda, and how many are militants who are of a slightly different stripe than al-Qaeda. And I think this becomes very important then when we start to talk about the new U.S. policy or what appears to be a new U.S. policy moving towards drone strikes in Yemen.
Okay, and what has been your traditional view on the extent to which the al-Qaeda threat is exaggerated, if at all?
I think certainly President Saleh has exaggerated the threat, but that doesn't mean that al-Qaeda doesn't exist independently of his exaggerations. I mean, This is something that he hasn't necessarily been behind planning, plotting, anything like that, but he certainly manipulated the existence of al-Qaeda to get more money from the West. And I think if you look at how the U.S. has doled out money to Yemen over the past 20 years, you can see how the U.S. has really incentivized this behavior, basically. If we go back to 1990, Yemen was on the UN Security Council. President Saleh voted against the security resolution to use force to expel Saddam Hussein from Iraq, and that really led to about a decade in which Yemen got very little, almost no foreign aid from the U.S. In fact, I think by the time the USS Cole attack happened in 2000, Yemen was getting about $400,000 a year from the U.S., and that was only in food aid. At the same time, both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had, Saudi Arabia in particular, expelled foreign workers, which really put a crunch on the Yemen economy. After September 11th, of course, Yemen benefited greatly from U.S. money and from U.S. trainers coming into the country. President Saleh went to visit then President Bush in November 2001, and they really hammered out an agreement that lasted for a few years. But by late 2005, 2006, when it appeared as though the al-Qaeda threat in Yemen had basically been destroyed, there was a U.S. drone strike in November 2002 that killed the leader, and then his replacements were arrested in the coming months. So by 2005, 2006, it appeared as though al-Qaeda had basically been eliminated, and the U.S. rewarded President Saleh by slashing aid across the board. And so what had been once a very great amount of money, by 2006 had dwindled down to $4.6 million. And since then, as al-Qaeda, in fact, regrouped exactly that year, exactly at the moment that the U.S. cut aid to Yemen is when al-Qaeda started coming back. Then we've seen the aid continue to rise since 2006, all the way up to what it was this year before the protests started. Okay,
and where would you say that anti-Americanism ranks on al-Qaeda's agenda? I mean, clearly they have tried to orchestrate some attacks against America, and the one guy, al-Waq, tries to be an inspiration to, I guess, jihadists everywhere, certainly including America, and maybe especially America. There was this report from ABC News recently that in the trove of data retrieved from the place where bin Laden had been living, it was found that bin Laden had repeatedly, I guess, according to this report, been urging al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the branch that's in Yemen, to attack America. Now, I took that as kind of good news. I mean, it seemed to me that if he needs to keep haranguing them to do that, then maybe left to their own devices, they wouldn't put it that high on their agenda. But what would you say is that branch of al-Qaeda's focus, and where do we rank in it?
Right. Well, one of the really interesting things about al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is that this is a group that has its roots in a prison break in February of 2006 from a maximum security prison in Sana'a. And so this group came into Yemen after one incarnation of al-Qaeda there had already been defeated. And it came into being just as another branch of al-Qaeda was being defeated and harassed out of Saudi Arabia by Saudi authorities. And it also came into being when a lot of attention was being focused on Iraq. And so what this organization did is it took a very patient approach to building up an infrastructure. Essentially, it took a lessons learned approach to the war, both against the Yemeni government as well as against the U.S. In a sense, it tried to learn from the mistakes that previous branches had made in Yemen. It tried to learn from the mistakes that the branch in Saudi Arabia had made, as well as from what was going on in Iraq. So from Yemen, it took away the lesson that, look, we can't be so centralized that an attack that kills the leader of our organization, like the U.S. drone strike in 2002 did, essentially causes the organization to crumble, basically cutting off the head and the body withers. So it learned that lesson. From Saudi Arabia, it took away the idea that we need to be very, very careful in who it is that we target. That is, that there's a very severe backlash if a number of Muslim civilians are killed as collateral damage during our attacks. And so they've tried to be very careful about brand control. And they also, from Iraq, they took away the lesson that some of these really bloody, violent, jihadi, almost sort of war porn movies that they saw coming out had the effect of turning large portions of the population away from it. And so when they got out, as they started to build up in 06 and 07, and I think it's important here to sort of set the context, and that is the Yemeni government was very distracted by a separate civil war going on up in the north. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. had really reduced its presence in Yemen, particularly its financial presence. And the U.S. was very much focusing on the war in Iraq as opposed to what was going on in Yemen. So al-Qaeda had a lot of time to really take this patient approach. And so they took these lessons learned. They really built up an infrastructure to the point that by 2008, 2009, they had really a strong enough infrastructure where they could survive the losses of key cell leaders. So the Yemeni government might break down a particular individual, but the organization al-Qaeda would still survive. And then it was in January 2009 where they merged with some of the former Guantanamo detainees who'd come south from Saudi Arabia into Yemen. And that was when we first saw the group start to branch out for attacks outside of Yemen. They'd been very active in carrying out attacks against foreign and government institutions within Yemen, and now we saw them start to go after first Saudi Arabia and then the United States. But since the beginning, al-Qaeda has been quite clear that it has three main targets, and that is Western interests within Yemen, that is non-Muslim interests within Yemen, Yemeni military and government institutions, because they believe the military and the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the Yemeni president, is closely aligned with the U.S. in a war against Muslims, so those are legitimate targets. And then attacks against regional powers such as Saudi Arabia, as well as the U.S. And they really make no distinction, at least in their rhetoric, between those, as well as between going after them. And I think with the Bin Laden constant advice, I think that Bin Laden was, of course, excited to see them go after the U.S., but he might have wanted them to go after the U.S. much more often. And this is something that, again, I think has a long history in al-Qaeda, that Bin Laden has always favored what he called a sort of a philosophy of centralization of execution and centralization of decision-making, and decentralization of execution. That is, he sort of gave his guys a target, and then they went out and did it as best as they could with the resources that they had.
Yeah, leaders of organizations are often in favor of centralization of decision making. Okay, so let's get into this new Obama policy. And of course, the context is that there's a certain amount of chaos in Yemen. The president has, well, I don't know whether fled is the word. I mean, because it's unclear to what extent he went to Saudi Arabia because of injuries sustained in an attempt to kill him by rebels. But in any event, he wound up in Saudi. It's also unclear to what extent Saudi Arabia kind of coerced him into going. Maybe all these things are clear to you. But anyway, all I know is he went to Saudi Arabia. And on top of the chaos that had for a while afflicted Yemen, there is, of course, the additional infusion of energy from the Arab Spring. And so it's kind of a mess. And apparently the Obama administration is, in some ways, I guess, sees that maybe as an opportunity, you could say. But in any event, they're going to shift their drone strategy, which had been in the hands of the U.S. military, which as a legal matter meant that drone strikes had to be approved by the Yemeni government, okay? It's moving that capability to the CIA. So now the CIA is going to be doing the drone strikes, which as a legal matter means they are not going to feel compelled to consult with the Yemeni government. And there is the expectation that the frequency of the drone strikes is going to increase substantially. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding, particularly this shift from the DoD to the CIA. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and what's your take on this?
Well, there's a number of things, but first, what we see the Obama administration doing is something that they've done previously. So right around the time, and you mentioned it earlier, the Christmas Day attack in 2009, this so-called underwear bomber. Right before that, on December 17th, the U.S. carried out an airstrike against what they thought was an al-Qaeda training camp in the south, in this province of Abiyan, which we mentioned briefly earlier. And so it's in December 2009 that all of this really starts. There's essentially the system in the U.S. is blinking red. There's all these lights going off. On December 14th, the State Department adds the head of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Nasser al-Waheishi, as well as a few of his deputies, to the specially designated global terrorist list. 3 days later, there's an airstrike that's carried out on this al-Qaeda training camp. Unfortunately, the U.S. didn't really get the al-Qaeda people it was after. Instead, it killed a number of civilians, a number of women and children. But that really opened up a short window of attacks that the U.S. carried out, basically going from December 2009 all the way until May of 2010. So during this time, the U.S. carried out a number of strikes. Unfortunately, many of the times they missed what it is or who it is that they were targeting. The last attack occurred in a central province of Yemen known as Marib, which has had a strong al-Qaeda presence for several years. Instead of killing the al-Qaeda operative that they were after, the U.S. actually killed a deputy government official who happened to be the deputy governor of Marib. And at that point is when President Saleh sort of pulled the plug on this operation and said, that's enough, no more attacks, this is becoming too costly for me politically. And so since that time, since May of last year up until earlier this year, we really didn't see any U.S. strikes. And that appears to be because President Saleh wasn't willing to acquiesce to the U.S. carrying it out.
And let me interject one thing.
Sure.
that notwithstanding the fact that their past attacks have not, as you just conveyed, not exactly been 100% accurate. Another thing that accompanies this shift of authority to the CIA is going to be a relaxation of the criteria for when you can strike. As I understand it, it's no longer going to be necessary to feel that you have confidently identified the person you're actually killing, but rather if kind of the pattern of behavior you see seems to fit the pattern of behavior of an al-Qaeda jihadist or something, then you're allowed to pull the trigger. Is that right?
That's my understanding as well, and that's a part of the policy. At least is how it's been reported by papers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. That's really quite frightening to someone like myself, who spent a lot of time in Yemen, who's talked to some of these individuals, and who has spent some time studying this, because I think there's a real problem here in what the U.S. is trying to do, and that is that by drawing the circle so wide, I think it risks expanding this war into something that the U.S. would just never be able to kill itself out of. That is, it just can't kill enough people to get rid of al-Qaeda. We have to, I think, understand that within Yemen there are a number of Islamists. Not all of them are al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, there's a very strict membership with al-Qaeda. In order to be a member, you have to swear this oath of allegiance, bay'ah, to the emir of the organization. Now, there are a number of individuals within Yemen who might look like al-Qaeda, might sound like al-Qaeda to people like you and me, to outsiders, but who aren't members of al-Qaeda. And this is really, really important. These are individuals, these Islamic militants, let's call them for lack of a better term, as sort of a broad category, who might have went off to Iraq to fight, might have went off to Afghanistan to fight, and they did that for very specific reasons. They did that because they saw Muslim lands being under attack by Western military force. When they got back to Yemen, they didn't see the same thing. And so on one side, you have al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that's making this theological argument that says to these other militants whom it wants to convince, that says, look, we are just like Iraq, we are just like Afghanistan, we are under Western military attack. Now, for the Islamic militants, they look and they say, well, there's no U.S. troops on the ground. We still have President Saleh, who, whatever one might say about him, is still nominally a Muslim president. There's been no invasion. And so al-Qaeda, for a long time, just wasn't able to convince these individuals of the legitimacy of their argument. And so they didn't take up arms against the state. We didn't see them carrying out these attacks. The danger with what the U.S. seems to be moving towards, what this policy is that as it goes after these individuals, I think there's a risk in expanding this war. That is, carrying out attacks on people based on patterns of life, based on, they look like al-Qaeda, they sound like al-Qaeda, maybe they even meet with al-Qaeda, to where we really extend this war and I think get the U.S. into a very significant problem in Yemen, whereby we just continue to fire missiles, but we never get any different results. I mean, the U.S. has defeated al-Qaeda in Yemen once, and the organization came back. And the organization learned from the mistakes it made in that previous round, whereas it seems as though the U.S. wants to continue fighting al-Qaeda the way it was instead of the way it is.
And what would you do then? Would you take drone strikes off the table, or would you use them very, very sparingly? Do you think it's the kind of threat that maybe needs no specific response, or what?
Right. I think this is a great question, and I think drones are a unique weapon that the United States has, and a unique tool that can be used when used judiciously. One of the frustrations that I have is I've been studying Yemen for a while, as have Bernard Hakel, Charles Schmitz. You've had numerous people on Blogging Heads who are very well informed about Yemen and have spent a great deal of time in the country. And I, of course, wouldn't want to speak for them. But one of the frustrations I have is that over the past few years, 4 or 5 years, I've in conversations, in publications, in different venues, I've expressed a number of different ideas that I felt the U.S. could do to tamp down the threat of al-Qaeda, to capitalize on the absence of al-Qaeda when the organization wasn't within Yemen, and many of these have really not been taken up, and I think many academics, many people outside of government express this frustration. And while I don't think it's sour grapes, the point is that these, what I would call missed opportunities, have consequences. That is, you can't wait 5 years and ignore advice for 5 years and then come later and say, well, now what do we do now that we've gotten ourselves in this situation, when there were numerous off-ramps earlier that could have been taken. So now I think it is a very serious problem, and it's going to take much longer and unfortunately much more money than I think the U.S. is really willing to spend. I'll give you a brief example, if I might.
Now, is this of something that you've long been recommending, or and would have been effective back when you were recommending, but now might not be, or this is something that would be useful right now?
I think it's still something that'll be useful. I just think it'll take much longer in order to see the type of results that the U.S. wants to see in Yemen. I mean, one of the problems is that the U.S., in my view, anyways, and of course I've never held a government position, and so I'm very much speaking from the outside, but I'm speaking as someone who spends a lot of time in Yemen and spends a lot of time talking with Yemenis. So I only bring one particular sort of lens to bear upon this problem. But that is that I really think the U.S. has viewed Yemen almost exclusively through the lens of al-Qaeda. That is, looking at the country as a counterterrorism problem that has to be solved. And I think by just looking at the country so one-dimensionally, the U.S. has missed a number of opportunities. I know we mentioned the the airstrike in December 2009, and there were some others that followed that up in December 2009. And in one of these areas where the U.S. hit, there was a small village, the village of al-Rafid, in which the village had been petitioning the Yemeni government for about 3 years to send teachers down to the village to really occupy the schools that it had built. But the Yemeni government never sent them. The village waited and waited. No one came. And eventually, the villagers got tired and got fed up, and they petitioned al-Qaeda to send some individuals. And so al-Qaeda sent some men to the school who started teaching the children. And they were there several months. And then after one of these strikes in December 2009, the men fled. And as recently as a couple of months ago...
Now, wait, let me it was a strike. Why did they flee? I mean, was it a strike right there in where they were? So,
yeah, it was a strike in that around
town.
That village, yeah.
We knew where the al-Qaeda guys were in that village, and we struck at them, and in that case, with accuracy?
I don't believe in that case that there may have been 1 or 2 al-Qaeda figures that were killed. This was in Shabwa. A province next to Abiyan, but many of them were not killed, and they fled the area instead.
Okay.
But the point is that this happened in December 2009, and now we are almost a year and a half or so after that, and no teachers have still been sent to the school. And so there was an opportunity by both the Yemeni and the U.S. government prior to this that they missed. And at least from where I'm sitting, they seem to be missing another opportunity after the strike as well.
Okay, and what effect do strikes, is it possible to even tell what effect strikes like that have on the ability of al-Qaeda to recruit? I mean, is it the case that if the strikes are accurate, then it is seen as a disincentive to sign up with al-Qaeda, but the problem is that whenever they are inaccurate, there's a substantial wave of kind of sympathy and favorable publicity for al-Qaeda. Is that the distinction, or what?
Right. There's a few different things. So I think that's certainly a possibility. Also, we have to be aware that the strikes that the U.S. carries out really play into the argument that al-Qaeda is making that Yemen is under Western military attack.
Right.
And so
that
bolsters the recruiting as well.
So even accurate strikes in the kind of, I mean, that's my sense in Pakistan, is that there's just huge resentment that we're just doing these strikes in the first place, right? It's not so much a question of whether they're successful, although of course killing civilians is worse than not, but that's kind of what I'm wondering. Is the overall drone strike program feeding into al-Qaeda's kind of propaganda?
It certainly does, but there's also, I mean, and I don't think that drones, particularly the way the Obama administration seems to be moving with that, are wisely used in Yemen. I think there's better ways to use them. I don't think they should be taken off the table completely, but I think there's a much better way to do it. That being said, I mean, these drones do have an impact on al-Qaeda. We know that the leaders are very frightened of them from things it is that they published in Arabic, from interviews that they've given on how much their security has changed in the past year. That is, they move around much more than they used to. They're quite frightened of these. And so that's on the positive side. So on one side, the U.S. has managed to kill some leaders, but again, this isn't like the first version of al-Qaeda where you kill leaders and the body withered. Now they have this infrastructure that's able to sort of absorb these losses. So there's that, and you're forcing the leaders to move. But on the other side, you have the resentment that's fostered. You have it folding into al-Qaeda's argument about Yemen being like Iraq or Afghanistan. And you see, in fact, we're starting to see foreign jihadis who are moving to Yemen as well, joining the ranks of al-Qaeda for the same reason that Yemenis went abroad to fight. And you also have the fact that the civilians and the tribesmen and the women and children who are killed in these drone strikes, these deaths don't take place in a vacuum. That is, these people have brothers, they have fathers, they have uncles who, in some cases, whether maybe inspired to join al-Qaeda because of the loss, looking for revenge, or in other instances, such as what we've seen lately, the tribe of the deputy governor in Marib, who was killed in May of 2010, his tribe, now that the government is weak, has seized on some of this chaos as a way to get revenge against the Yemeni government for its complicity in the strike. And so they've been very active in cutting the roads within Yemen, in cutting electricity, in cutting shipments from the provinces to the capital. And so this sort of feeds into the chaotic environment in which al-Qaeda operates.
Okay, so killing the wrong people is definitely counterproductive, whether it's civilians or government officials or what. But you also suggested, if I heard you right, that one thing the very existence of an American drone strike program does is make Yemen a little more of a magnet for foreign jihadists to gravitate toward, because then it's officially on the list of Muslim nations under attack by the United States.
Yeah, I think we're starting, it's always very dangerous when you're looking at a group like al-Qaeda that there's so little evidence and so much of it is very fragmentary and some of it very conflicting. There's a danger of I think, reading too much into too little. But I think we're starting to see signs that there are more individuals who are being attracted to Yemen at the moment, yeah.
Okay. That's not good. Are there any other things you would do? One reaction you get to the idea of sending teachers to the schools is like, oh man, this sounds like a lot of work, right? In other words, this is it's kind of a little bit like the counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism argument in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Winning over the civilian population is a pretty big job, and there may be people who say, "Wow, you really got to do it retail if you're going to go solve the various social ills in Yemen to keep it resistant to Al Qaeda's penetration." So I'm wondering, first of all, what would you say to that, and what other kinds of things would you do? Are there things you do that are in another category?
Right. Well, first, I think it's important to remember Yemen's been mismanaged for a very long time. President Saleh's nearly 33 years of rule have not brought the country economic prosperity. They've not, unemployment is rampant. We see this in the protests, as I'm sure we'll talk about quite soon. And as I went over the U.S. history of doling out aid to the country, it's, I think, incentivized the wrong things at different times. So Yemen went back and forth as far as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a fundraising or an aid development organization that the Bush administration had founded in 2004, and they used that as sort of as a political football in order to try to get Yemen to do some of these things. So there's a lot of muscle memory that the U.S. and other outside powers will have to work against. And I'm not saying that I think the U.S. Should just start pouring money into the country. I don't necessarily know if that's the best way to approach it, but I think the U.S. has a unique role in that it can really do, I think, a very good job in organizing regional and Western cooperation and taking a political lead and using a great deal of money from the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other states in the region, to come up with to really help Yemen go forward. Because while the perception is that al-Qaeda has a very easy time within Yemen, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think al-Qaeda has to work pretty hard in order to get its message, particularly its message of a violent jihad within Yemen, to be taken seriously. And so I think there's a lot that the U.S. and the regional powers could do if they were able to work together on some sort of a a shared platform. But I don't think we're seeing that right now. I think we're seeing the U.S. pursuing what it thinks will work out best for its national security, and particularly given the elected officials that are making these decisions. I mean, the last thing any elected official in the U.S. wants is a strike emanating out of Yemen. So they're trying to keep the terrorists back on their heels so that no attacks happen, while Saudi Arabia is pursuing a slightly different policy. But these are all sort of short-term strategies that just kick the can down the road a little.
Right, and I'll ask this one last question before we do move on to kind of backing up and looking at the overall kind of revolt. You said that, there's a frustration that you and other academics feel that the advice that actual experts on Yemen give to governments never seems to get implemented. And how much of that is the fact that the government's agenda is really not to find a long-term solution? I mean, if you're the President of the United States, what you don't want above all is a big terrorist attack in between now and the next election, right? I mean, is that, you think, fundamentally the problem, that the long-term cures, that what you would do for a long-term cure is different from what you would do to minimize the chance of a short-term attack, and in fact there's a tension between those goals, and that politics keeps us focused on the short term?
I think there certainly is a tension. I mean, I know, based on my own personal conversations and personal experience, that there's a lot of very smart individuals within the U.S. government who have a great deal of expertise in Yemen, and who I believe have a very firm grasp on some of the problems. But we've seen a lot of shifts. For example, when you look at, say, the U.S. Embassy in Yemen, this is something where after the call, and particularly after September 11th, we really saw a movement away from, say, risk management to avoidance of risk. That is, the embassy became the fortress. Diplomats were no longer allowed to travel out. Some of their recommendations were shot down, and so forth. And it's these... it's really working against this ingrained, I think, as you put it, short-term politics within Washington that leads us into some of these problems that we find ourselves in, with really no good solutions. And then what you have in places like Yemen is you have, say for instance, you have a very talented ambassador who does very good work. But then he or she moves on, and the person who comes in maybe isn't as talented. Maybe they start to do things a little bit differently, or the policies in Washington start to shift, which I think we saw between 2004 and 2005 when you had two ambassadors in Yemen. One who was very focused on al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda went away. The other ambassador was sort of left out to dry a little bit by both the decrease in funding from Washington, as well as the sort of drift of policy and policy negligence within Yemen.
Okay. All right, now let's back up and look at the larger picture. Now, even before the Arab Spring, the Yemeni government had various problems on its hands and hadn't had firm centralized control of the nation. You had this Shiite sect in the north that resisted government control. In the south, you had something that was, I guess, sounds like it fits a little more the profile of the protesters in the Arab Spring in general, relatively secular, and talking about democratic values and stuff, as I understand it. And neither of these things is al-Qaeda, which I guess had more success in central Yemen. So the government had all of that on its hands. And then the Arab Spring shows up, and you get this fresh wave of revolt that seems to be part of that. Can you kind of connect the Arab Spring to the pre-existing situation in a way that will help clarify things for me?
Well, I'll give it my best shot. How about that?
Okay, that'll work.
So I think you did a good job of painting the picture. So in the north, right on the border with Saudi Arabia, in this province of Sada, you had a civil war that started in June of 2004, an uprising, an armed rebellion. But the roots of this go back very deep into Yemeni history. For the 2 decades previous to this, this group Shiite sect, as you called them, they're Zaydis, and I think we have to be a little careful here, because when people like you and myself hear Shia, we tend to think of the 12er Shias in Iran or in Lebanon or in Iraq, and this is not the case in Yemen. The Zaydis are Shia in name and certainly Shia in practice, but they're much closer to Sunni Islam, to mainstream Sunni Islam, than are 12er Shias.
And they are, as a technical matter, they are fivers, apparently, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
And President Saleh himself is culturally and traditionally from a Zaydi family, as are most of the political elite within North Yemen. But the problem is that these Zaydis in the north, Yemen had been an imamate, North Yemen had been an imamate for over 1,000 years. That was overthrown in a revolution in 1962. And after that, the imamate was dissolved and a republic was established. And so these Zaydis, which are really sort of the torchbearers of traditional Shia thought within Yemen, saw themselves as sort of the target of this two-pronged alliance. So first you had the Republican government that wanted to do away with them because they were afraid they would make a comeback. And then you saw the Salafi, al-Qaeda, Wahhabi types, if both from Saudi Arabia as well as from within Yemen, who viewed them as sort of rejectionist, as non-Muslims that were also making inroads. And so they'd been sustaining this for 2 decades, and finally in 2004 it spilled over, and they've been fighting ever since. In fact, the sixth Houthi war, as they're being called, ended in early 2010. At the same time, in the south, you have this, what's called a Southern movement, which is this broad, very nebulous group that really got it started about 2007. And if we go back really briefly into Yemeni history, North and South Yemen unified in 1990. 4 years later, there was a civil war, and President Saleh put down quite brutally an attempt at secession. And in fact, troops under his command, under the command of Ali Musa al-Ahmar, were very active, as well as some jihadis from Afghanistan, very active in really sacking and destroying the southern capital of Aden. And so President Saleh didn't have any trouble with the South, or any great trouble with the South, until about 2007, when this sort of new generation started protesting against the lack of jobs, what they viewed as northern aggression, the fact that the North was taking much more of the economic pie than they had. And there have been a number of demonstrations leading up, but it was really the Arab Spring in 2011, earlier this year, that brought all these different groups together. So it brought the Houthis in the north, the Southerners, and throughout Yemen. I mean, Yemen is, as we've mentioned, in very bad economic conditions.
So wait, do I understand you correctly that it has united the opposition to some extent? I mean, so that the government now faces a more unified opposition than it had faced before the Arab Spring?
It's unified them in the sense that they're all part of this anti-Saleh coalition, but the coalition itself is very creaky. And so it's not at all clear what happens when sort of the magnet at the center, the man holding all these different disparate groups together, is removed from the scene. And I think that's what a lot of people are very concerned about right now.
Although in principle, I thought the objectives of the different groups are not entirely incompatible. In other words, the people in the north want to be left alone, and the people in the South want to be left alone, right? That's what I thought. Originally, they both would have been happy with either some degree of autonomy or outright secession, at least before the Arab Spring. That was my impression. I mean, but is it not going to be that easy to resolve their various aspirations, to reconcile their various aspirations?
I think it's going to be more difficult than some people think. I mean, the calls for autonomy, yes, they're true to a certain extent, but they're true because the people, for instance, in the southern movement, felt as though they would be better off economically under their own autonomy than they would be under the North. And so if that doesn't work out, then what happens? I think that's a big question. Also, part of this, what I've called the anti-Saleh coalition, are people like the al-Ahmar family of the Hashid Tribal Confederation,
Right.
as well as Ali Musa al-Ahmar, this general who's defected. Both of those groups, the Hashid Tribal Confederation, as well as Ali Musa al-Ahmar, were very active on the front lines in fighting the Houthis, and now they're on the same side in this anti-Saleh coalition. So there's a lot of bad blood under the surface that is going to have to be dealt with in a way that's, I think, amenable to both sides in order to move forward in any sort of a unified Yemen.
Okay, so everybody who was against the government before the Arab Spring is still against it, and in addition, there has been some defection from certain on the part of certain tribes or tribal elites or something. So sounds like kind of a mess. And does Al-Qaeda have a close connection to any of this necessarily, or it is just trying to exploit it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Al-Qaeda is active within the protest. They're not in any of these squares of change for the youth, at least in any known as a known entity. They're very much cheering on Saleh's downfall, or what they hope will be Saleh's downfall, with the idea that they can then exploit what comes next. And so everyone or a number of people, I mean, President Saleh still has supporters, as a piece by Laura Kasnoff in the New York Times talks about today, but a number of people within Yemen have jumped ship who had been supporting his regime and now are allied against them. And so you sort of have a struggle on two levels. You have the struggle against President Saleh and his family, and then behind the scenes, you have this jockeying among different groups within the opposition, whether they be tribal leaders, whether they be military leaders, or so forth, as to try to make sure that they come out on top in any sort of a post-Saleh solution.
Okay, and then you've got Saudi Arabia, which cares deeply about all this and would like to have stability and a compliant government. What does it have a plan for putting the pieces back together? It now has effective control of Saleh, the President Saleh, who's in Saudi Arabia, I guess. But is it clear how Saudi Arabia plans to try to cool things down?
It's not clear to me. I mean, I think President Saleh was pretty badly injured because he didn't want to leave Yemen. There was the attack on June 3rd that was clearly an assassination attempt. We're not sure who was behind it, but it took place in his private mosque within the presidential palace. One individual who was at the mosque has since died. A number of very high government officials are very seriously injured. And President Saleh left the next day on June 4th for Saudi Arabia. But I think it was only the advice of the Saudi doctors who had come to Sana'a that really forced him out of the country. The fact that he couldn't get the help he needed within Yemen. And as one Yemeni put on Twitter, that's really a damning indication of President Saleh, the fact that he ruled the country for 33 years and he'd never been able to build a hospital that was capable of even providing himself with decent medical care. Yeah. But as far as Saudi Arabia goes, I think historically the kingdom has wanted Yemen to be weak enough that it couldn't challenge Saudi Arabia, but not so weak that chaos coming out of Yemen threatened Saudi Arabia. And that's a very fine line to walk. And what we see happening, I think, right now is that there's this older generation of princes, people like Crown Prince Sultan, who for a very long time held the portfolio on Yemen. He's been very ill recently, and there's this older generation, and then there's a younger generation, people like Mohammed bin Naif, who's the deputy minister of the Interior, one of Saudi Arabia's rising stars, has very good contacts within the West, as well as Crown Prince Sultan's son, Khalid bin Sultan. So there's this generational shift, and it's become a bit messy in that I don't think a lot of people know who within Saudi Arabia is really steering the ship when it comes to Yemen. That is, it seems as though Mohammed bin Naif has control of certainly the al-Qaeda portion of the portfolio, but he doesn't seem to have control of Saudi's policy towards Yemen at the moment.
Okay. And do you see if you were Saudi Arabia, or if you were just a person who would like some degree of stability to return to Yemen, and for that form of stability to represent kind of progress over the form that came before, do you see a path to that?
I think there is. I don't think it's one that Saudi Arabia wants to go down or is very willing to go down. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the same country that sent troops to Bahrain. A couple of days ago on Sunday, Tawakkul Karman, who's a very inspirational woman in the protest movement within Yemen, penned an op-ed in the New York Times, and basically her conclusion was that both Saudi Arabia and the United States want the president to change, but want sort of the system to remain the same. Mm-hmm. And she argued, and I think she did so very convincingly, that that's not in the long-term interests of Yemen's stability. The people don't just want a change in names at the top. They want to see significant changes. But that's something that I think Saudi Arabia views as being against its long-term interests. And I think this is a real problem that the U.S. has had in recent years, as the U.S. sort of, I'm not sure if this is what it's doing, but what it appears from the outside is very much the U.S. is running its Yemen policy through Riyadh. And I think that that's dangerous, because I don't think that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are aligned on long-term interests within the region. If what President Obama in his speech several weeks ago laid out is in fact what the U.S. seeks, then I think they're diametrically opposed. And so going through the GC, or letting Saudi Arabia take the lead, or letting the Gulf Cooperation Council, the group of 6 countries in the peninsula, take the lead on Yemen, while the U.S. supports from behind the scenes, I think will take the U.S. down a road that ultimately it doesn't want to go down.
Why? What is it that's going to be at the end of the road that the U.S. doesn't like?
Well, I think that you'll see, instead of a democratic, a stable Yemen, you'll see what Saudi Arabia, if the U.S. continues to let Saudi Arabia run the show, you'll see what you've seen in Yemen over the past several decades. That is, spots of instability, spots of chaos. You'll see a government that doesn't have full control over the country. You'll see a potential for terrorist threats coming out of Yemen. Essentially, if you continue to do what we've been doing, we'll continue to get the same results that we've been getting.
Which is an authoritarian government that only barely manages to maintain authority.
Well, it has authority, but doesn't, the way President Saleh has always ruled has been by playing off one opposition group off against another, as opposed to building some sort of durable institutions that can survive the passing of key personalities. Mm-hmm.
And Is Saudi Arabia on board with a more robust drone strike program on the part of the U.S. as seems to be in the offing? Do they have any problem with that?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm the best one to talk about Saudi Arabia's ideas with the drone. I do know that Saudi Arabia has been very active in cooperating with the U.S. when it comes to getting or attempting to get the individuals within al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula who are in Yemen. I mean, we have to remember that there are a number of Saudis within the organization, a number of Saudis who have been former inmates in Guantanamo. Some of these, the Saudis have been successful in bringing back into the fold, whether through threats or through coercion or through simple negotiation. But this hasn't always worked. In fact, one of the Saudis disguised himself as a repentant member, someone who wanted to come in and hand himself over to a prince, and in fact that was a ploy in order to get close enough to Prince Mohammed bin Nayef in order to attempt to assassinate him. That bomb failed, but that was the precursor to the December 2009 underwear bomber over Detroit. And so Saudi Arabia is very well aware of the threat of al-Qaeda and has been working closely with the U.S. to tamp it down. How much that has changed as U.S. strategy towards drone strikes has changed is, at least for someone sitting where I am, very hard to discern at the moment.
Okay, but it sounds like maybe what the U.S. is going to do is, they're gonna ramp up the drone strikes and the counterterrorism program, but beyond that, maybe kind of outsource Yemen policy to Saudi Arabia in a certain sense? I mean, go along with what Saudi Arabia wants to do?
Yeah, follow Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia has more influence than the U.S., particularly financial influence. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. at different times has more leverage than I think it realizes, and that is what the president says, what the Secretary of State says, what it is that the ambassadors say. All of these matter a great deal. And in fact, when the people in Yemen, the people in the streets have been looking for inspiration, certainly they've been looking to Tunisia and Egypt, but they've also been looking to the U.S. And many of these revolutionary groups want the U.S. to find, they believe that the U.S. has made a choice in Yemen, and that is they think the U.S. has chosen its security interests over what the U.S. likes to call its traditional values, things like freedom, like democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so forth. And they'd like to see the U.S. switch that, or at least make them even, and at least see the U.S. pursuing what the U.S. has called its traditional values.
Well, and you might say it's also privileging short-term security considerations over long-term security considerations if you believe that the realization of its values in that part of the world would, in the long run, drain energy from the jihadist movement, as a number of people believe.
Right, but that is something that takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of nuanced understanding, and it takes a concentrated and focused effort. And I think what we're seeing right now is that the U.S. and the Obama administration, as the Bush administration before, is being seduced by seemingly simple solutions. But I think when it comes to groups like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, there really is no magic missile solution to that problem.
Right. So it sounds like here, as in Bahrain, the U.S. is going to be willing to settle for being on what, by its own definition, is the wrong side of history in a certain sense, in contrast to the position it took in Egypt, for example.
Well, it took the U.S., and I was here in Egypt. I mean, I lived through most of the revolution, and there was a lot of frustration here as well. And Secretary of State Clinton has taken some shots in the local press. It's taken the U.S. The U.S. has always been a bit behind the curve when it comes to these Arab revolutions, and I think it continues to be behind the curve in Yemen.
Yeah, although we in the end, I'd say we changed our position in Egypt sufficiently to certainly really piss off the Saudis, so that's got to say something, right? And it looks like we're not going to be willing to do that in Yemen.
The U.S. has been clear that it wants the removal of President Saleh, but I think it's difficult. I mean, President Saleh has been in power for 33 years, and he's integrated himself into different clans, into different tribes, into different institutions through politics of marriage and through other things that make it hard to get him out now. And so I think that's why we see this impasse at the moment with President Saleh being in Saudi Arabia. But the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and other groups are really stepping lightly as far as how to transition from him because they're worried about the power that his sons and his nephews and other relatives have and the potential for further chaos and further bloodshed that can come if these individuals think that outside powers are helping to shepherd any sort of a transition. And so it's a really delicate, really very difficult problem that we face in Yemen. But I think we can and should be doing better.
Okay, I guess I am no more optimistic than I was at the outset of this conversation, which sadly probably reflects an accurate assessment of the situation. Is there anything? Yeah, go ahead.
No, well, I mean, hopefully we'd be a little bit more optimistic, but yeah, it's a mess. It looks bad at the moment, but I think. One of the things that has always encouraged me on trips to Yemen has been the spirit and the really the vibrancy that I see within Yemenis. And I mean, it could have been much, much worse. And it of course, can still be much worse. But what we've seen so far is that Yemenis have really come together. We've seen tribes that have stepped in to take over security in some areas. And so I think there are positive There are positive things that if you're looking for indications for the future of how this can get better, I think there are some things to build on.
And I think I have heard that Yemen, much more than a place like Libya, did have a somewhat evolved culture of kind of civil society. Is that right, or am I totally misremembering?
Well, I've never been been to Libya, so I can't speak about that. But I've always been impressed by what I've seen within Yemen when it comes to civil society, when it comes to different organizations, whether it be the tribes or whether it be groupings within Sana'a. I think there are positive things, and there is a way forward here. But I think it is going to be difficult, and there is going to be jockeying for power. There are going to be different groups who, for their own sort of sectarian or political goals, will try to usurp the power here, and so it's a delicate operation, but one that isn't completely hopeless, even though a lot of the indicators suggest that it could get worse.
Yeah. Okay. And in closing, is there any positive sign you would look for? Any news you're hoping to hear from Yemen? Anything?
One of the things I think that I'm really looking to hear is, over the past couple of years, the U.S. has put a lot of money into counterterrorism, as we've talked about, and focusing on al-Qaeda. The recipients of that have been President Saleh's sons and nephews, and these are the individuals who are really causing the key problems right now. So there is, I think, an opportunity that the U.S. has the most leverage with the individuals that matter the most right now, and I'd really like to see the U.S. take advantage of that leverage and that influence and really try to help shepherd some of these individuals out of the conflict, out of the brewing conflict, to make room for a transition council, because the U.S. has put a lot of money into the country in recent years, and I'd like to see it get some return on that.
Okay. Well, I hope it happens, and thanks very much for sharing your insights, and congratulations again on being formally inducted to the Twitterati. And I'll let you get back to basking in the celebrity that comes with that.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Gregory. Bye-bye.
Bye.